They said I was just another nurse who got lucky. My late husband's children stood in that courtroom and called me a gold digger who preyed on their dying father. Their attorney, one of Boston's finest, painted me as an uneducated caregiver who manipulated a vulnerable man in his final months. What they didn't know was that I had walked away from a $15 million career to hold their father's hand while he took his last breath. My name is Catherine Hayes. I'm 63 years old, and this is the story of how I became invisible by choice, and how that choice came back to haunt me in ways I never imagined. It started on a Tuesday morning in March when a courier knocked on my door in Brookline. I was tending to my roses, the same ones I'd planted with James during our first spring together. The man handed me a thick manila envelope with the efficiency of someone who delivers bad news for a living. Inside was a lawsuit. James's daughter, Victoria, and his son, Marcus, were contesting the will. They wanted the house, the investment accounts, everything James had left me. According to their filing, I had used undue influence to manipulate their father into changing his will during the final 6 months of his life, when pancreatic cancer had weakened his judgment. I sat on our porch swing, the same one where James and I had watched countless sunsets, and read every word. The language was clinical, brutal. They claimed I had isolated their father from his children, that I had prevented them from visiting, that I had whispered poison in his ear about his own flesh and blood until he rewrote everything in my favor. None of it was true, but I understood why they believed it. I met James Hayes 3 years ago at Massachusetts General Hospital, not as his nurse, though that's what his children assumed. I was volunteering in the cancer ward, reading to patients, holding hands with people who had no one else. I'd done it every Thursday for 5 years, ever since I'd retired. James was in for a consultation. Stage 3, pancreatic cancer. His children had dropped him off and left, promising to return in 2 hours. They didn't. I found him 4 hours later, still sitting in the waiting room, too proud to ask anyone for help calling a cab. I drove him home that day. We talked about Boston, about the changing neighborhoods, about how the city we'd both grown up in barely resembled the place we remembered. He told me about his late wife, Mary, who'd died 10 years earlier. I told him about my late husband, Robert, who I'd lost to a heart attack 15 years back. I didn't tell him what I used to do for a living. It didn't seem relevant. I was just Catherine, a woman who volunteered at hospitals and grew roses. He was just James, a man who'd built a successful commercial real estate business and was now facing his mortality alone. We fell in love slowly, the way people do when they've both already had their great loves and lost them. It wasn't passionate or dramatic. It was comfortable, like finding a warm place to rest after a long journey. 6 months after we met, James asked me to marry him. His children objected immediately. Victoria, a pharmaceutical sales rep in New York, flew up to lecture me about appropriate boundaries. Marcus, who worked in his father's company but had never shown much interest in actually running it, accused me of targeting vulnerable seniors. James married me anyway. We had 2.5 years together. They were good years, even with the cancer. Especially because of the cancer. In a strange way, we both knew our time was limited, so we didn't waste it on small arguments or petty grievances. We just loved each other. When the cancer progressed to stage 4, I took over his care completely. I bathed him, helped him to the bathroom, measured his medications, held his hand through the night when the pain was too much for morphine to touch. Victoria came up twice. Marcus came once. They stayed for an hour each time, uncomfortable and eager to leave, unable to look at what their father had become. I didn't blame them. Death is ugly, and not everyone can face it. But James saw their absence. It broke something in him that the cancer hadn't managed to touch. 3 months before he died, he called his attorney and changed his will. He left his company shares to Marcus, enough to ensure his son would never want for anything. He left Victoria a trust fund that would generate 6 figures annually for the rest of her life, and he left everything else to me. The house, the investment accounts, the life insurance, it totaled about $8 million. They don't need it, he told me, his voice weak but certain. Marcus has the company. Victoria has her career. But you gave up everything to be here with me, Kat. Everyone else left, but you stayed. I tried to argue. I told him I didn't need his money, that I'd stayed because I loved him, not for any financial gain. He just smiled at me with that patient expression he'd developed during his illness. I know that, sweetheart. That's exactly why you're the one who should have it. He died on a Sunday morning in October. I was holding his hand. His children arrived 20 minutes after he passed, summoned by my phone call. Victoria immediately asked about the will, not how her father had died, not whether he'd been in pain, just the will. I should have known then what was coming. The lawsuit arrived 5 months later. By then, I'd donated $500,000 to the Cancer Research Center at Mass General in James's name. I'd established a scholarship fund for nursing students at Boston College. Another $300,000. I was planning to volunteer at a new hospice opening in Cambridge. I wasn't spending James's money on myself. I was using it the way he would have wanted, to help others. But his children saw it differently. To them, I was squandering their inheritance on strangers. The court date was set for June. I had 3 months to prepare. Marcus and Victoria hired Thornton and Associates, the most prestigious litigation firm in Boston. Their lead attorney was a woman named Rebecca Thornton herself, founder of the firm, known for winning impossible cases. Everyone told me to settle. My own attorney, a kind man named David Chen who'd handled James's estate, gently suggested that fighting would be expensive and emotionally draining. The children were offering me a deal. I could keep the house and $2 million, but everything else would be redistributed according to their proposed arrangement. I said no, not because I wanted the money, but because James had made his choice clearly and deliberately, and I wouldn't let his children rewrite his final wishes just because those wishes hurt their feelings. David looked worried. Catherine, Rebecca Thornton doesn't lose. She's going to paint you as a predator. She's going to make the jury believe you manipulated James. And without any documentation of your own financial independence, it's going to be your word against theirs about your motivations. I smiled at him. Then I suppose we should start gathering documentation. The confusion on David's face was almost worth the trouble that was coming. I spent the next 2 months making phone calls I hadn't made in years, reaching out to people from a life I'd left behind. By the time June arrived, I had everything I needed. The courtroom was in Suffolk County Superior Court, a beautiful old building that had seen countless family dramas play out within its walls. Victoria sat behind Rebecca Thornton, looking grieved and righteous in a black dress. Marcus sat beside her, his expression carved from stone. Rebecca Thornton was exactly what I'd expected. Mid-50s, impeccably dressed, the kind of sharp intelligence in her eyes that made opponents underestimate her warmth at their peril. She nodded politely at me as I entered. I nodded back. Judge Richard Morrison presided. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 50, with gray at his temples and a no-nonsense expression that suggested he'd heard every excuse in the book. Rebecca's opening statement was masterful. She painted James as a lonely, sick man, made vulnerable by pain and medication. She painted his children as devoted but busy, unable to be present as much as they'd wanted due to work obligations. And she painted me as a calculating woman who'd seen an opportunity and taken it. The defendant volunteered at hospitals, Rebecca said, pacing before the jury. She specifically volunteered in cancer wards. She had access to vulnerable, wealthy patients and their families. She knew exactly what she was doing when she drove James Hayes home that day. She knew he was alone. She knew he was scared. And she knew he was worth millions. It was a compelling narrative. I watched the jury absorb it, saw some of them glance at me with expressions hovering between pity and disgust. Then it was David's turn. He did his best, bless him. He talked about love, about commitment, about the 2.5 years James and I had shared. He mentioned the children's infrequent visits, the way I'd cared for James without complaint through the worst of his illness. But facts are slippery things compared to emotion. Rebecca had given the jury a story they understood. Evil caregiver preys on sick rich man. David was asking them to believe something more complicated. That love could bloom in unlikely places. That marriage didn't always require decades of history to be real. The trial proper began. Rebecca called Victoria first. Victoria cried on the stand. She talked about how close she'd been to her father, how devastated she'd been when he got sick. She claimed I'd screened her calls, prevented her from visiting, systematically isolated her father from his family. The last time I saw Daddy, she said, dabbing at her eyes. He barely recognized me. He was so drugged up. And she was there the whole time, hovering, watching. I wanted to spend time alone with him, but she wouldn't leave the room. It was a lie. Victoria had come up once in those final months, stayed for 40 minutes, and spent most of that time on her phone dealing with a work crisis. James had asked her to stay, but she'd had to catch a flight back to New York. But I couldn't prove it was a lie. It was my word against hers. Marcus testified next. He was more measured, more careful. He talked about his father's declining mental state, the morphine doses, the way James would sometimes forget what year it was or call him by his late mother's name. My father wasn't competent to make major financial decisions in those final months, Marcus said. And Catherine knew that. She took advantage of his confusion to rewrite his will in her favor. Another lie. James had been clear-minded when he'd changed his will, lucid and certain. His attorney had documented his mental competency specifically to prevent this kind of challenge. But Rebecca was planting doubt, and doubt was all she needed. Then Rebecca called Dr. Patricia Simmons, the oncologist who'd treated James. She was a reluctant witness, I could tell. She answered Rebecca's questions carefully. In your professional opinion, Dr. Simmons, could the medications James Hayes was taking in his final months have impaired his judgment? They could have, Doctor, Simmons admitted. High-dose opioids can cause confusion, especially in elderly patients. So it's possible that James Hayes was not fully competent when he changed his will 3 months before his death. It's possible, yes. Rebecca smiled. No further questions. David did his best on cross-examination, getting Dr. Simmons to admit that James had also had long periods of lucidity, that pain medication doesn't automatically equal incompetence, but the damage was done. By the end of the first week, I could see it in the jury's faces. They believed I was guilty. Why wouldn't they? Volunteer nurse marries dying rich man, changes his will, inherits millions. It was the plot of a bad TV movie. David pulled me aside during a recess. Catherine, it's not going well. Rebecca is destroying us. If you have anything, any evidence that you didn't need James's money, now would be the time. I'm representing myself for the remainder of the trial, I said quietly. David blinked. What? Catherine, no. You can't. Rebecca will eat you alive. I appreciate everything you've done, David, but this is something I need to handle personally. When court resumed, I stood and addressed Judge Morrison. Your Honor, I'd like to represent myself going forward. Mr. Chen will remain as advisory counsel, but I'll be conducting my own defense. Rebecca couldn't hide her smile. Judge Morrison looked skeptical. Mrs. Hayes, I strongly advise against that. Miss, Thornton is an experienced litigator. Without legal training, you'll be at a severe disadvantage. I understand, Your Honor, but I have relevant experience that I believe will be sufficient. What kind of experience? I'd prefer to demonstrate rather than explain, if that's acceptable. Judge Morrison studied me for a long moment, then sighed. It's your right. But don't say I didn't warn you. Rebecca stood for her next witness. The plaintiff calls Catherine Hayes to the stand. I walked to the witness box calmly. The bailiff swore me in. I sat down and folded my hands in my lap, meeting Rebecca's eyes steadily. She stalked toward me like a predator approaching wounded prey. Mrs. Hayes, before you met James, what was your occupation? I was retired. Retired from what? Nursing. So you worked as a nurse? For how long? I was a registered nurse for 33 years. Rebecca nodded, as if I'd confirmed something important. And you volunteered specifically in cancer wards. That must have given you significant insight into the vulnerabilities of cancer patients and their families. It gave me insight into suffering, I said quietly, and compassion for those experiencing it. How convenient that your compassion led you to a wealthy widower. Objection, David said half-heartedly. Argumentative. Sustained, Judge Morrison said. Miss Thornton, ask questions. Don't editorialize. Rebecca smiled. Mrs. Hayes, at the time you met James, what was your net worth? I'd have to check my records for an exact figure. Approximately? I'm not certain. Were you wealthy? That's subjective. Rebecca's smile widened. She thought she had me. Did you have significant assets of your own? Enough that you wouldn't need James's money? Yes. That stopped her. Yes? Yes. I had significant assets of my own. How significant? Again, I'd need to check exact figures. But substantial. Rebecca glanced at her notes, thrown off her rhythm. Mrs. Hayes, we've examined your financial records. You have one checking account, opened in James's name, after your marriage. One savings account, also opened after marriage. No investment accounts, no retirement accounts in your name. Where are these supposed assets? Under my previous name. Your previous name? Before I married Robert Hayes in 1985, my name was Catherine Morrison. Rebecca shrugged. That doesn't explain. And before I married Robert Hayes, I continued calmly, I was Catherine Morrison, Chief Nursing Officer of Massachusetts General Hospital. The courtroom went very still. Rebecca stared at me. Excuse me? I was CNO at Mass General from 1998 to 2012. Before that, I was Director of Nursing. Before that, Associate Director. I worked at Mass General for 33 years total, rising from staff nurse to the highest nursing position in the hospital. I watched Rebecca's face drain of color as she did the mental math. CNO of Mass General. One of the most prestigious hospitals in the country. That wasn't just a nursing job. That was an executive position, 6 figures, probably low 7 figures by the end. Your Honor, I said, turning to Judge Morrison. I'd like to submit Exhibits A through K, my employment records from Massachusetts General Hospital, my final compensation statements, and my retirement account documentation. David stood quickly, fumbling with a folder he pulled from his briefcase. He looked dazed, like he couldn't quite believe what was happening. He handed the documents to the bailiff. Judge Morrison examined them, his eyebrows rising. These appear to show that Mrs. Hayes retired from Mass General in 2012 with a pension of $125,000 annually, plus a retirement account valued at, he paused, $14 million. The courtroom erupted. Victoria gasped. Marcus went pale. Rebecca looked like someone had punched her in the stomach. I continued speaking calmly over the noise. I retired early at 54 to care for my first husband, Robert, who was dying of heart disease. After his death, I lived off my pension and investment income. I volunteered at hospitals because healthcare was my life's work, and I wasn't ready to leave it completely. When I met James, I had approximately $15 million in assets. I didn't need his money. I didn't want his money. I married him because I loved him. Judge Morrison banged his gavel. Order. Miss Thornton, do you need a recess? Rebecca had recovered some of her composure, but her hands were shaking. No, Your Honor. Mrs. Hayes, why didn't you mention any of this before? No one asked. You were so certain I was an uneducated nurse who'd stumbled into wealth. You didn't bother to do basic due diligence on my background. Why keep your maiden name for your finances? Professional reasons. I'd built my career as Catherine Morrison. After I married Robert, I was known socially as Catherine Hayes, but I maintained my professional identity as Morrison. Most of my investment accounts, retirement funds, and professional credentials are still under that name. It's not unusual in my generation, particularly for women who married after establishing their careers. Rebecca glanced at her notes desperately. If you're so wealthy, why did you accept James's inheritance? Because he asked me to. Because it mattered to him that I be taken care of. Because refusing would have hurt him in his final months, and I loved him too much to do that. I looked directly at Victoria and Marcus. Your father knew about my finances. I told him everything after he proposed. He said it didn't matter, that he still wanted me to have his estate because I'd given him something money couldn't buy. I'd given him companionship and dignity at the end of his life. Convenient that he's not here to confirm that, Rebecca snapped. But his attorney is. I nodded to David. James discussed my financial independence with his lawyer when he changed his will. Mr. Chen can testify to that. David stood, looking shell-shocked. It's true, Your Honor. James told me explicitly that Catherine had been financially independent and that he wanted to leave her his estate despite that fact, not because she needed it, but because she deserved it. Rebecca made one last attempt. Mrs. Hayes, if you're so wealthy and noble, why are you fighting to keep James's money? Why not just give it to his children? Because that's not what James wanted. He left Marcus control of his company and Victoria a substantial trust fund. He made his choices deliberately. I'm here because I won't let anyone, including his children, override his final wishes, just because those wishes inconvenience them. I turned to face Victoria and Marcus directly. Your father loved you both. He talked about you constantly. He was proud of you. Even when he was hurt that you couldn't be there more often during his illness, he left you both well provided for. What he gave me wasn't about money. It was about acknowledging that I stayed when everyone else left. Victoria was crying, real tears this time. Marcus had his head in his hands. But, I continued, I understand that you're grieving. I understand that losing a parent is devastating, and that grief makes us act in ways we might later regret. So, I'm going to make you an offer, and I want Judge Morrison and this court to witness it. I pulled a folder from my bag. I'm donating $6 million to establish the James Hayes Foundation for Pancreatic Cancer Research. The foundation will be run by a board that includes both of you. If you choose to participate, James's name will fund research that might save other families from the loss you've experienced. Additionally, I'm setting up education trusts for any grandchildren James might have in the future. When and if you have children, their education will be fully funded from birth through graduate school. I'm keeping the house because it's where James and I were happy, and because I planted roses there with him that I'd like to tend. I'm keeping enough of the investment accounts to ensure I can continue living comfortably. The rest, about $2 million, I'm splitting between various charities James cared about. I looked at them steadily. You can accept this, or you can continue this lawsuit. But know that if we continue, every detail of your minimal involvement in your father's final years will become public record. Every missed visit, every phone call you didn't return, every time you were too busy to sit with a dying man who loved you. I don't want to do that. But I will defend James's final wishes, and I will use every resource at my disposal to do it. The courtroom was silent, except for Victoria's quiet sobbing. Judge Morrison cleared his throat. Miss Thornton, does your client wish to respond? Rebecca looked at Victoria and Marcus. They were both staring at me with expressions I couldn't quite read. Shame, maybe, or grief, or both. Finally, Marcus spoke. No, Your Honor, we need time to think. Judge Morrison nodded. I'm calling a recess. We'll reconvene in 1 week, but we never did reconvene. 3 days later, David called me. Victoria and Marcus had dropped the lawsuit. They wanted to accept my offer. More than that, they wanted to apologize. I met them at the house the following Saturday. Victoria hugged me, sobbing into my shoulder. I'm so sorry, I thought. I don't know what I thought. I was so angry that Dad loved you, that he'd moved on from Mom, that he'd changed. I wanted someone to blame, and you were there. Marcus was quieter, but no less sincere. Dad was happy with you. I saw it but didn't want to admit it. I thought if I didn't acknowledge it, if I didn't accept you, then somehow Mom wasn't really gone. I was wrong. We talked for hours that day. They told me stories about James I'd never heard, about their childhood, about the father he'd been before illness changed him. I showed them photos from our time together, the joy in James's face even during his sickness. It didn't fix everything. Grief and regret are complicated, and healing takes time. But it was a start. The James Hayes Foundation launched 6 months later. Victoria took an active role, using her pharmaceutical connections to build relationships with researchers. Marcus donated additional funds from his own accounts. They weren't doing it for me, they were doing it for their father, for his memory, for the man they'd loved and lost and were finally allowing themselves to properly mourn. I still volunteer at hospitals. I still tend my roses. I live quietly in the house James and I shared, surrounded by memories of a good man and a peaceful love. And sometimes, when I'm in my garden and the light hits the roses just right, I think about that courtroom and Rebecca Thornton's face when she realized she'd built her entire case on the assumption that an older woman couldn't possibly have her own power, her own success, her own wealth. People see what they expect to see. They saw a nurse and assumed helplessness. They saw a volunteer and assumed lack of ambition. They saw a woman who'd married a sick man and assumed predation. They never thought to look deeper, to ask better questions, to consider that a woman might choose a quiet life not because she was incapable of a loud one, but because she'd already lived loudly and found she preferred the peace. I was chief nursing officer of one of America's best hospitals. I managed thousands of staff members, oversaw billions in healthcare operations, and shaped policy that affected countless lives. I earned every dollar of my fortune through decades of grueling work in a field that demands everything and gives back grief and glory in equal measure. Then I retired, married a good man, and spent his final years holding his hand while he died. Both things are true. Both things are me. And if James's children learned anything from all of this, I hope it's that underestimating people, especially women of a certain age who seem ordinary, is a mistake they'll never make again. The roses James and I planted are blooming now. They're beautiful. And I'm exactly where I want to be, doing exactly what I chose to do, with no regrets and nothing left to prove.